Hello everyone, and welcome to Unit 2, Managing Stress and Emotion. This is the second unit within the first module of the course, 3440, Managerial Leadership and Managerial Skills. Last week we covered the introduction to the class, which was really around self-awareness and how to use this course to develop your own leadership and managerial skills. Today what we'll be doing is covering stress and emotions at work. We'll be looking at a general model of stress. We'll be looking at some ways of dealing with stress. And then we'll talk about emotions and some models of emotions within the workplace. It's important that we cover these topics within a leadership class because in study after study, when we look at the types of skills that successful leaders and managers have, rising to the top almost every time is this ability to really deal with one's own emotions and to be able to deal with the emotions of others within organizations. So not only to be able to understand your own emotions, but to understand the impact of how you feel and what you believe on others, and then also in turn what they feel and what they believe and the impact on the work that they're doing. One of the things that we'll cover explicitly within this course is stress because of the significant experience of stress for managers within organizations. You would have seen some of this in your reading. A lot of the managers in your text talk about stress and the stress of managerial work. So I want to make sure that I'm giving you some tools to really work through ideas around stress, and it's really only just a beginning. This is an ongoing thing, learning to deal with and to work through stress. So let's begin. This is something that you've probably seen before, but this is my highly scientific version on a chart that I drew with my markers that gives you a sense of the idea of the relationship between stress and performance. So as you know, and as I'm sure from your own experiences you are well aware, stress has a very useful role in our lives, in that stress is the thing that gets us up. It gets us moving. It gets us prepared. If you don't have a little bit of stress before doing something, it means that likely either it's not important to you, or there isn't any consequence to it, and it's just something that's easy. So I often think that if it's something that you respect, if it's an activity that you respect, something that requires a bit of challenge, then stress is a good thing. I often tell my children when they say, "Mom, I'm really anxious about the test tomorrow," I'm like, well, that's good, because that anxiety is what's going to make sure that you study hard, that you prepare yourself, and that you are completely focused when that paper is put in front of you. So stress can be quite useful. But as you can see by the shape of this U curve, there's a moment at which stress is optimal, but then any additional stress actually decreases our level of performance. This stress is the type of stress that really cripples us, that leads to experiences where we can no longer do what we could do under normal conditions. And this is the type of stress that we hope to avoid as managers, or hope to find ways of coping and dealing with as managers, because it really can lead to some very negative effects. As you read in your text, it can lead to all kinds of social issues, social withdrawal. It's very easy to carry the stress and work to your home life, and then to be stressed with people in an environment that are completely out of context, that have nothing to do with the source of stress itself. Stress can very easily and very quickly lead to all kinds of physical outcomes, such as loss of sleep, and your eating habits can be worsened, and in cases where things get a little more significant, you can depress your immune system and end up getting sick, being very susceptible to illnesses. In an extreme case, it can lead to very serious and significant illnesses. So stress is certainly something that we want to get a handle on. So here's a general model of stress. I'll spend a little bit of time in the next slide talking about the stressors, but it's important to note that there are a variety of sources of stressors as a manager. There's anticipatory stress, stress of the encounter, stress of time and stress of situation, and we'll go through each of these in turn on the next slide. But I want to demonstrate that stress can lead to all kinds of reactions, both physiological and psychological, that I've already alluded to, right? So increased heart rate, sweaty palms, negative emotional responses, negative cognitive responses. So you can start to feel badly and your thoughts can start to spiral. You can easily become less rational. You start to narrow your focus, so it's very difficult to problem solve when you're feeling stressed, because you actually narrow, this is a evolutionary response. You narrow your focus and you end up seeing less possibility rather than more possibility. So that's the exact opposite viewpoint that you need when you're dealing with problem solving. So there are all kinds of reactions that stress induces that can be problematic. So we want to create a place where individuals can be more resilient, where they can be physically resilient, psychologically resilient, and socially resilient, where they can have ways of supporting themselves and finding environments that support them so that they can rebound from stress and still be up for a challenge, but at the same time not feel as though these significant consequences are resting on their shoulders. So let's go into a little bit more detail within this model. Let's go through the sources of stress. One source of stress that I'm sure you feel already, even whether you're a manager or not, is the stress of time. It seems as though there is just too much to do and there aren't enough hours in the day to do it. Layer that on top of a manager who is responsible for the work that's being done today, planning for the future, and for any type of incidental activity that might come up or interaction that might come up in the workplace. They might be responsible for dealing with a conflict between peers. They might be responsible for supporting and assisting an employee who's having a difficult time on a task. All sorts of unplanned activities can come up that really can interfere even with a well-laid plan. So time can easily get away from you in these circumstances. There's also the stress of encounters, and I have that that's demonstrated here by these two individuals who are arguing. So there's the stress of that just comes with being around people. As a manager or a leader, you're often looked to as the one who's responsible for all kinds of interactions within the workplace. So if somebody's not getting along with somebody else, if somebody's having some difficulty on the job integrating themselves socially into a group, you're the person that is often looked to solve these types of encounters, and that can be very difficult. There's also the issue that often you are negotiating with or dealing with people, trying to solve problems with people where you're doing two things at once. You're trying to first solve the problem, but also to maintain the relationship with that individual, to make sure that you can continue to work together. So it's not enough to say, well, this is what I want, take it or leave it. You actually have to figure out a way to get through the issue while in a way that supports the people that you're responsible to, but also respects this relationship because it's an ongoing working relationship. And that stress can be quite difficult too. Balancing the needs of multiple constituents or multiple groups that look to you can be a very difficult thing. So these are stress of encounters. Then there's the stress of the situation. So the environment itself, and this is the lemons and limes here, where you find yourself, the context, the environment can lead to a great deal of stress. And whether that's some sort of changing legislation, changing environmental context, new developments, new expectations, all of these things can cause you a great deal of stress because you have to respond to it. And not only do you have to respond to it, you have to find a way of responding to it that meets the business needs, but that also you can support the rest of the people within the organization, and you can lead them through this situational issue. And that can be a fairly difficult task. And finally here with the clock and the person waiting and looking at the clock, there's anticipatory stress. So what do I have to do tomorrow? Every day there are some fairly difficult things on your calendar as a manager or a leader. Having to give somebody feedback can be difficult. Having a big meeting or a big presentation, having to make a report. All of these things are challenges. And even though you might be well prepared, you might have everything you need in order to do it successfully, it still requires a fair amount of cognitive effort, which can leave you thinking about it even in your off hours, leading to anticipatory stress. So there are quite a few sources of stress for managers, and even beyond that, these are general sources of stress according to stress models, but pulled from your text. Here are some sources of stress identified by the managers within your text. Role strain, so having to walk that balance again between leading the people within the organization, so managing the people below you, but also looking upwards to the people who are above you, planning for the future. The role itself can conflict. The things that you have to accomplish can be in conflict with one another, leading to some role strain. There's also negativity. Oh goodness, this one's a big one. This is one that I am quite familiar with in my role and the times that I've spent as a manager. As a manager, you always get all of the dissatisfaction. People come to you when things aren't working out, when things are not as they would expect or anticipate or hope for. So it's a lot to be the bearer or the listener of all of these negative comments and attitudes, and that can be stressful, because you kind of feel you have to respond to each and every concern or each and every complaint. It's a big burden to bear, and that can be a difficult place to be in. It takes a while before you figure out how to manage all of this information on your own. There's also the sense of isolation. So as a manager, you spend a lot of time on your own. You might have other managers that you can bounce ideas off of. You have people that you report to. But in your work group, often you are the person on the outside. So whereas once you may have been invited out for drinks after work, or you may have been invited to birthday parties of colleagues' children or colleagues themselves, you might not be in that circle anymore as a manager. So it can be fairly socially isolating, and any type of social isolation can be a source of stress. There are a number of burdens of leadership, meaning that leadership has to hold the responsibility for things that they themselves may not actually be responsible for proximally. They are by virtue of having been in charge, but it could be that somebody else has done something that has led to failure, or that didn't work out, or an idea that didn't fly, and it becomes the burden of the person in charge to carry the weight of that responsibility. You can't turn back and say, this is your responsibility to carry. So all of this can lead to a fair amount of stress, as the managers in your text allude to. So the question becomes, how do we deal with stress? Well, there are a number of ways of dealing with stress, and I imagine as a student you've already started to adopt some of these, or you've started to think through how you best deal with stress. But I'll give you the broad categories, and then we can talk for a moment about some of the specific methods for dealing with stress. First, there is the idea of being fairly active and eliminating the stress itself. So getting rid of the thing that is causing the stress, either closing off the project, eliminating an employee, moving something out of your sphere of responsibility. This is not always possible, but it is here. It is an option. It is one of the ways in which you can reduce stress. Another one is to be proactive, and this means just to develop resiliency strategies. So to develop ways of coping with the stress itself. And this could be, like this is in advance, right? So you're developing ways of when things happen, here's how I will respond. And there can be lots of strategies for this, right? So it could be, for example, as an academic, I send a lot of material to journals to be published, and part of the process is that my articles are returned to me with comments and feedback. You never get an article accepted outright. You always have to make some edits or some changes to that article before it's accepted. And I'm quite aware that I will hear some things that are difficult to hear, that I don't want to hear, some criticism that's fairly harsh every time I receive the feedback from a journal. So I have some strategies that I use that help me to remain resilient in those moments. So I would receive an email from a journal indicating, with the feedback in an attachment or within the body of the email, whichever it is. I would open up the email and I'd read it once, and I would very clearly separate myself from the feedback. I have an emotional response very quickly. So often my responses are things like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. I can't believe it. What is this? This is ridiculous. But then I close the email and I put it to the side. I put the information to the side, and I move on to other things that where I can find some success. And I often wait a day or two before going back to the project at hand. So I have a time limit, essentially, that in which I can stew on the feedback. And often on the second and the third look, things start to look a little bit more reasonable to me. The feedback looks like, oh, I get it. That actually makes a lot of sense. And here, even if the feedback might not be accurately representative of what I was trying to convey, well then, maybe I didn't convey it in the way that I intended. So let me look at that. So I have a way of starting to respond that keeps me resilient. And finally, you might have some reactive strategies. You might have some temporary coping mechanisms that help you to remain resilient. This could be that you every time that you feel an intense emotion, you have a way of distancing yourself from the situation. It could be that you have somebody that you talk to as soon as you are in a difficult situation, right? So other strategies that you might employ that I'm sure you've heard about or that you've heard are great stress reducers, are making sure that you're healthy, making sure that you are eating a good diet, especially when stress is increasing, making sure that you're getting physical activity. Some of these can help to counteract some of both the psychological and the physiological responses to stress that we have normally. I also want to introduce, you could spend a lifetime just exploring this idea of how to deal with inappropriate responses to stress. So stress that has crossed over into challenging areas. But I want to introduce this idea that may seem a bit psychologically driven at first, but I think is a very useful tool to have in your back pocket as a way of dealing with stress. So Ellen Langer at Harvard University is an expert in mindfulness. There is a video that has been posted for you that's associated with this unit that is required viewing, where you can get a better sense of mindfulness and the act of mindfulness. Mindfulness can be a great tool for dealing with stress. And essentially what mindfulness is, it's an activity whereby you are aware of everything in your environment, but you don't let it affect you. And you heighten your awareness even, like you become quite aware of everything that's around you, a process of actively noticing everything and accepting it. And so in this mindfulness, you're detaching the emotional response from the thing that you're observing. It also helps you to become a little bit more anchored into the present moment and helps to eliminate some of this anticipatory stress or the stress that has to do with things that are outside of your control. So please watch the Ellen Langer video to get a better sense of the idea of mindfulness and the mindfulness tool. Mindfulness research within leadership and management has been shown to have great promise for being incredibly effective. So I would encourage you to spend some time exploring it. Mindfulness, there is a thing called mindfulness meditation, but that's not exactly what you're exploring when you're looking at mindfulness in the Ellen Langer fashion. But I do want to challenge you to think about the idea of meditation. Again, this is another activity that can help you to take a moment of high stress and really flatten out the emotional response and become more aware of the broader world or the other things in your environment that really can help to keep you calm and keep you focused on the task at hand. There's a challenge activity in this unit. You'll see a link to challenge meditation. If you've never tried meditating before, try that activity and then take part in the discussion that follows, asking, what was it like? Did you think it was a useful activity? Was it not a useful activity? I would be very interested in reading your comments on this particular exercise. I want to end this lecture by talking for a few moments about the idea of emotions within the workplace. This is a very broad literature, a large literature on understanding how emotions interact with performance and with management and with leadership. I'm going to speak specifically to two types of two constructs within the emotions literature that I think are quite important for management and leadership development. The first is emotional intelligence. This may be a phrase that you've heard before. It's become quite popular in practical circles. And essentially what emotional intelligence speaks to is our ability to understand our own emotions, to understand the emotions of others, and to deal with that interaction. So this is something I talked about very early in this lecture. Well, here is the term that describes it. And here's a piece of interesting research that I think can really highlights the importance of emotional intelligence for managers and leaders. There's a finding in organizational behavior and human resource management that people who are intelligent, people who have a high IQ, perform better than people who have lower IQ. So if you're on a spectrum, there is a positive relationship between IQ and performance, right? A positive correlation. But if you have a moderate IQ, so if you have a very strong IQ, but not on the genius level, you can actually perform better than somebody with a higher IQ if you have a high EQ, a high emotional intelligence. So we know that emotional intelligence, particularly for work that is social, bolsters IQ and leads to increased success. For managers and leaders, it becomes critical to have a strong IQ, or EQ rather, to be able to understand how what you are doing and saying is impacting those that you lead, how to respond to the emotional responses of others, how to communicate in a way that is understanding of what is happening with others. All of this is wrapped up in emotional intelligence, and this is something that can be critical to management responsibilities. So something to think through about what do you believe your emotional intelligence is? Is this a place where you think you need to think through or improve your strength and your ability to deal with emotions with others? Is this something you shy away from, or is this something that you feel you have great competence in? And finally, there's this idea of emotional agility. Emotional agility is our ability to manage our own emotions and to be mindful of the space between the stimulus, so the thing that happens, and our response to it, to manage our own response to things within our environment. You read an article about emotional that speaks quite clearly to emotional agility, and the things that I want you to take away from that article, or to really think through within that article. There are 4 things in particular. One is this idea of being mindful. So being aware of the emotions that you have, and not being reactive, being able to manage and understand the reaction that you have to the feelings, your responses to others, and your responses to environmental cues. The other is to externalize your emotions. So sometimes it can be helpful if you're angry within the workplace. The workplace has a certain set of social etiquette, has a certain social etiquette, right? Like, you can be angry, but you can't really go about yelling at people in the workplace, and there are certain things certain ways of behaving within workplaces. And sometimes when we're highly emotional, it can be helpful to externalize that emotion by, not saying I'm angry, but to say, I think that my response to that is that I am angered. And this type of distance from the emotion can help to make you more flexible, and can help to minimize your reaction. The next thing that's talked about a great deal within the emotional agility literature is this idea of understanding your values. This is number 3. So this is not just understanding your values and then moving on and, here's what's important to me, and then I'm going to go about my day and do as I have to do. But it's really understanding your values and helping them to guide how you set your goals and the things that become important to you. So there's the response of I ought to do this, or I want to do this. And understanding the distinction, right? There are things that you have to do because they are a requirement for your job, or a requirement for the work that you're doing. But trying to move yourself towards work where you are doing more of the I want to stuff that's aligned with your core values, can keep you in a better place, and can make the work more engaging, and can also make you a better manager, a better leader, because you become more connected to what's important to you. And finally, understand how to move, the direction you're moving in, when to move on, and how to move on. As this is linked to the idea of understanding your core values. And you want to ask yourself, am I getting closer to or further away from who I want to be with the work that I'm doing? And this emotional agility, being aware of this concept as it's described in your readings, and being aware of some of these ideas, can really help you to set a clear path for yourself, your own development, but also in the way that who you will be as a manager, and the way in which you will treat others, and how you will respond to others. So within this unit, you're walking through a series of activities and readings that have to do with stress and emotion and emotional responses. And again, while you read it, I ask you to reflect on your own abilities, your own strengths, and your own development as a manager and leader, and to think through where it is you want to put some effort. What are the things that you hope to develop over time? All right, that is the end of Unit 2. I should start getting rid of these things. That is the end of Unit 2. Thank you very much, and please complete all of the other material that's associated with this unit. Take care.